The Israeli Supreme Court will convene next week with all justices present for the first time ever to discuss the validity of the limitation of the reasonability clause law as it was passed by the Knesset as part of the government's judicial reform. What will happen in the next few weeks and who might the key players be? Speaking about different scenarios, the Jerusalem Press Club hosts Professor Reuven Hazan from the Department of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a department he previously headed. Professor Hassan is an expert in the field of electoral system and political parties. Hello, Professor Hassan. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning.
So, what do you think is the most important development regarding the plan presented by the president? And do you think this path of negotiation may actually have a chance?
Oh, you're asking several questions rolled into one. The most important thing is that if the two sides accept the compromise, and there are several items in it, so you can't just pick one, it will mean that the meeting, the outstanding meeting of the Israeli Supreme Court next week will not take place. And therefore, Israel will avoid what, for no better term, is called a constitutional crisis, but we don't have a constitution. So this is a term that might make sense to people outside of Israel, but in Israel, we have to think of something different.
So it seems that the voices in the Likud calling for a compromise are growing. Think that Yariv Levin, with all of his power, can stop them for long?
Oh, I don't know. We have more elements than just the Likud in the current government. Likud has only 32 out of 64 seats. That is half. The other four parties, two of them extreme hawkish right-wing parties, they will not buckle. In other words, they are not going to go for the compromise. And the two ultra-Orthodox parties, they will not go for the compromise unless they are given something that is more important to them, such as the compulsory military draft bill. In other words, there are too many balls in the air. In order for Netanyahu to be able to move forward on the compromise, he needs to not only get his party together, and you stated correctly, there are elements in the party like Yariv Levin who will say no. And the question is, how powerful is Yariv Levin compared to Netanyahu? The last 9 months of this government have shown that Netanyahu will buckle in to Yariv Levin's demands whenever we get to a crossroads. But half of the current government is unwilling to buckle in because they have their own agenda, whether it is a settler agenda or an ultra-Orthodox agenda, and the Supreme Court is an obstacle in the path. And all of this has to be done by the 12th, because if not, the justices will meet. This is just too much to be done in such a short time. We are in the land of miracles. It's still possible, but every hour that passes by makes this compromise less possible. And keep in mind, it's not that both sides are working very hard towards the compromise. They are now debating whether they even want to work towards the compromise. So we have a long way to go and very little time.
Okay, so it's challenging time for a compromise. But from the other side of the political spectrum, many of the reform's opponents also lean left when it comes to their political views. Only yesterday, former Mossad head Tamir Pardo said Israel was applying apartheid rule over the Palestinians in the West Bank. Is there a connection, or do you see a connection between political stances and the degree of objection to the government's plans?
There's always a connection, because what we're talking about now, which is not just the judicial overhaul, but an entire revamping of the relationship between the three branches of power in Israel, a lot of it emerges from the desire by certain elements, and then I go back to the religious Zionist party, to implement policies in the territories concerning land, concerning the Palestinians, which are basically non-democratic in nature. So while you see them as part of the government and their desire to restrain the Supreme Court in order to get their policies passed, you see on the other side, the side of the protesters, the anti-occupation movement being very vocal in the opposition to the government. But let's put these two aside. because we have extremists on both ends, the pro-government and the anti-government. And right now, it is not the extremists that are saying no. If both sides' extremists were saying no, maybe this is a good compromise. It is actually some of the more moderate elements in Benny Gantz's party, in Yair Lapid's party, in Netanyahu's party, who are not happy with this compromise. So until the moderates on both sides can clearly come together and say that they're willing to ditch the extremists and work together because they have a majority in the parliament to push this compromise through, we're not going anywhere. And right now, we don't even have them on board.
And what do you think should happen in order for the moderates to work together?
Oh, the moderates can easily work together when they have someone that they can trust. And regretfully, we have a prime minister in Israel that nobody in the opposition and many elements in the current government do not trust. In other words, everybody is seeing very clearly that this compromise is aimed at achieving one thing only, and that is to stop the Supreme Court from convening next week. And the minute that happens, then we reach a position where the current Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is ending her term of office soon. And if the Supreme Court does not convene next week, will it be able to reconvene very quickly? In other words, the opposition doesn't trust Netanyahu. And if they don't trust him, the only way they will come to the table is if legislation is passed that will allow the opposition to trust the law and not the person who is prime minister. Now, let's remember the Knesset is on recess right now. In other words, we have to get everybody to agree. We have to convene a special session of the Knesset. We have to maybe undo the reasonable clause bill, which is part of the compromise, and pass a bill, a basic law bill, that says that we will not change any of the other basic laws in the next 18 months. This is a Herculean task if we had 6 months. We only have 6 days.
Okay, yes, challenging. So talking about the Supreme Court, the president of the court decided to hold discussion over the reasonability clause with all the preceding justices present. What is the significance of this?
There are two significances. First of all, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Israel, unlike, for example, in the United States, where all 9 Supreme Court judges sit for every case, in Israel we have 15 judges, and the Chief Justice decides which judges will sit on which case. Usually it's 3, maybe 5 judges. In very extraordinary circumstances, we've had 9, 11, we had 13 once, we have never had 15. The choice of 15 is sending 2 political messages. First, the Chief Justice is not picking certain judges, more liberal or more conservative ones, in order to sway the decision. She's putting everyone in, which means that everyone will have something to say. Second, if you go back to one of the reforms that Yariv Levin proposed back in January of this year, it was that the Supreme Court would not be allowed to strike down legislation unless all 15 judges sat in one panel, which means she is not only removing the political element of which judges will sit, she's actually handing to the government something that they want, which is that all the judges will sit together. Now, this means she's playing politics, because with 15 judges, if the decision is 8-7, it will rip the country apart. If the decision is 10-5, it will be a strong decision. If the decision is 13-2, the government is going to have a very difficult time saying that they won't adhere to that decision if it's such an overwhelming majority.
So, building on that point, what may happen if the court rejects the limitation of the reasonability clause law and the government decides to ignore the court's ruling?
Well, this is a question that no one can answer because we have never been in such a situation. As I said, Israel does not have a constitution, so we don't have a specific piece of legislation that says that the courts are the last ones to make a decision and the government must accept it. If you heard the Speaker of the Israeli Parliament yesterday, he said that the Knesset will not sit down quietly as the courts force a decision down its throat. So I can't tell you where we will go. According to democratic theory, the courts are the final arbiters, and it is not for the politicians to say we accept this or not. In other words, once the court decides, if it decides, that the reasonable clause law that was passed is, again, I'm using the incorrect terms, but in order to apply them for your audience, that this is unconstitutional and therefore invalid, it is not for the politicians in Israel to say, well, we don't accept this. The reason that the politicians can say this is that we have no rules of the game. We have no constitution. And if we get to that point, then we have a war, we have a conflict, a battle between two branches of government in Israel. Who represents the people? Who represents democracy? Who has the upper hand? We have never been there before. And everyone, from you to me to the army to the police, are going to have to decide, who do we listen to? Any government in Israel, I don't care if they're right or left, that brings the country to such a position is a government that is not only incapable of fulfilling its role, but a government that sees that what is good for the country is not its best interest. We should never get to that point.
Very clear. Professor Hassan, thank you for your time today.